Laura, thanks very much. What I'd like to do is just give you a chance just to tell me what you remember about the early stages, because I think I've got down here, those early comments by the teacher right back in double naught, isn't that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So just give me some sort of background on the early signs and symptoms and the problems that you thought about, even going back now retrospectively and thinking about how it all started and when they started to come up.
Okay. You know, hindsight's a beautiful thing. If I look back now, I can see probably signs even earlier than that, knowing what I know now. Had I known then, perhaps our journey might not have been quite so difficult. But I would say we were first alerted to the fact is when he first started school at 3.5. His teacher picked up he was a little behind with coloring, cutting, very loath to sit at the table and do any kind of fine motor skills work. He loved to play outside. He embraced the school, but he didn't enjoy doing the puzzles and the sort of learning based work. And the following year was grade double naught. And it was then that the head of the preschool, who's an educational psychologist, met with me. And she said, look, she thinks there's an issue here. She can't really put her finger on what it is, but it might be an idea to have him seen by an occupational therapist. At that stage, I was still very much arms crossed. Boys, boys, he loves to play outside, let him be a kid. It'll all be fine. So that was kind of my view. Again, in hindsight, perhaps I should have listened, but I didn't. I just thought, well, he started preschool later than the other kids. Just give him a chance, he'll be fine. So then we went into grade R, and luckily he had just the most incredible teacher in grade R. And she came to us and said, look, I really would suggest an occupational therapy assessment because he's so willing and he's so good orally, but we're not getting anything down on the paper. It's just not happening. So we did. And that's how this all started. But the occupational therapist was more going along the visual dyspraxia lines rather than there being an underlying issue of ADD. And yeah, had we known that there were different types, that the stereotypical hyperactivity doesn't need to be there, the reckless behavior, the behavioral issues that sometimes come along with it, that's very, it's a stereotypical way of looking at ADHD. And we didn't know any better. So we thought, well, it can't be because he doesn't display any of those behaviors. He's willing, he's a fairly quiet child, very compliant, but he's just got this issue. After a year of occupational therapy, we weren't seeing any progress. And in fact, homeschooling was our saving grace. It was a blessing and a curse, but probably the best thing that could have happened because I saw for myself in a classroom setting, if you want to call it that, what the actual problems were. And it was shocking. The teachers had actually been quite gentle with how they had explained that he'd had some issues. It was, he'd have to copy a sentence and 5 minutes later he'd written one letter. And not that he couldn't do it. We'd been through the alphabet with him again, or I had when I was homeschooling him. We'd specifically gone through each letter, and when I was standing next to him, and he could do it. But as soon as I moved away, it just, there was nothing. He just could not bring it together to put it down on the paper, even copying. And after 6 weeks of frustration with him, thinking, you know, he's had a year of occupational therapy, he's not mixing his letters up, he knows what they are. You know, is he just being strong-willed? Does he not just not want to do it? It was incredibly frustrating. And again, not knowing that there could be this kind of underlying learning disability, it became much more frustrating, and the empathy kind of started to wane for what was happening. And again, in grade 1, he had the most phenomenal teacher. And we had a Zoom meeting with her one day because it just got to the point where both of us, it was interfering with our relationship. We've always had a loving relationship. He's always been so, as I say, compliant, willing to please, and it became combative. He was mullish and stubborn and just closed off to any kind of educational input from me at all. And it was his grade 1 teacher who suggested that we have him assessed by you. And it was sort of more along the lines of, well, if it isn't, we haven't lost anything, but at least we know to then maybe move on to something else. It might be something different, but let's just find out. And that's when we came to you.
Yes, Laura, I mean, that's an amazing story, how I suppose the serendipity of COVID really brought those things to light, didn't it, really?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, if it hadn't been for that time he spent at home and you saw it yourself, it might have taken a bit longer.
It definitely would have. I would still probably today be sitting at parent-teacher meetings with my arms folded, thinking, you know, he is only 7. Just give him time. Maybe it's just a maturity thing. He's young for his age in the class, you know, that kind of thing. And they don't like to come right out and say, listen, yeah, this is a huge problem. You really need to sort it out. They kind of try and approach it gently. So it's easier to just sort of brush it off and think, well, you know, we're getting him occupational therapy. He's getting all the help he needs. What more do you expect of me? And it really was, as I say, something very, very good came out of something very, very bad, because as parents, we don't see how our children are in the classroom. We get told via a third party how they are and if it's very different from how they are at home, it's hard to believe. Because we don't do that kind of work with them normally at home. We do a little bit of homework. It's really minor. Doing the actual learning, teaching them to read and write, that really showed up where we were having big problems.
Laura, do you think that he was, if you go back even before he started school, that there were early signs right from an early age that there were some challenges?
Yes, definitely. Again, with the benefit of hindsight now, he was quite a fussy baby. He didn't like to be on his tummy. Anything where he had to actually push up or do sort of anything like that. He didn't like being on a playmat. He actually he was actually quite grumpy. We used to call him grumpy. Right up until we did what we were told we should never do, and we got him a walker. And we popped him in the walker, and the moment he became mobile and independent, he was a different child. So I suppose looking back now, that very probably was an issue, and probably even earlier still, trying to get him to feed and things like that was always, we always had to find creative ways to get him to do it. So if I look at that and then I think, well, you know, that probably, well, he was born this way. And his milestones were all fine, but they were all gross motor, you know, milestones. He spoke when he should, he crawled when he should, but everything was always just a little bit tough. Um, I only have one child. I've got no experience with other babies. So for us, that was just what we had. But I would imagine his 7-year journey through life thus far probably would have been less difficult had we noticed some of the earlier signs. He wasn't ready to go to school at 2. We tried. He was so anxious after 3 weeks. Every time we put him in the car seat, he would vomit. And the school said to us, it's fine, it'll come right, it'll come right. And it just really didn't. So we took, you know, we made the decision and we said, well, we're going to pull him out of school and we're going to keep him at home with us for a little longer. He's just not ready, which is why he actually only started at 3.5.
Laura, do you think that the occupational therapist made a massive difference?
No, I would say definitely not. It helped with his gross motor skills, strength in his upper body, which is never really, he's had really strong legs. He's jumped on the trampoline since he could walk. That's always his go-to. But his upper body strength wasn't great, and they thought that might be not helping, obviously, with the fine motor skills, etc. So they did work on that, and it did help initially. I would say in the first 6 weeks, we saw some improvement in the classroom with him having more stamina holding a crayon or whatever it is they were doing. His occupational therapist now that he has is actually at the school, and she comes and gets him for half an hour. And she focuses, she does a little bit in the beginning with the stretchy things and to sort of get him all relaxed. And then she sits with him at the table and she teaches him properly, pencil grip. This is how you hold your pencil, froggy fingers, getting his, you know, the reversals, teaching him how little poems, you know, bat before ball if they're doing a B, or the doorknob opens the door. And that has definitely helped. But without his medication, he would not get the benefit of the occupational therapy. And I think that was the problem, because the major underlying problem was still there. That year of occupational therapy was actually wasted. He was just not absorbing and gaining from it like he should have been.
Laura, if I can ask you to tell me a little bit about how you saw his organization in the morning, from the time you get up in the morning, getting ready for school. What were the challenges that you experienced?
Oh, well, we get up very early. We did. We used to get up very early, and I was still dressing him for school at the beginning of grade 1, because by the time he'd put his socks on and his belt, and we were now running really late, and even getting up, I mean, I'd have to have got him up at like 3:30 in the morning if I'd have allowed him to do it himself. And, you know, you still get, you know, the people, well, you must let him do it himself. He'll learn. But, you know, time is also a factor when they have to be at school by 7 o'clock. So in the end, you just think, I'm just going to do it because we have to go now. He could never follow more than one instruction at a time. Any more than that, and it would be lost in translation. And even then I'd say, right, get up, have a wee, and come down to the dining room. And he'd get up and he'd come down to the dining room, and he'd forgotten to stop at the toilet, which is on the way to have his wee. So it was very challenging. And obviously eating has always been a bit of a difficulty with Alex. So trying to get some sort of protein into him before school it just took so long, and I'd have to keep saying, chew, swallow, don't forget to eat. And this would be the repertoire every single morning. In fact, he very kindly notified his grade 1 teacher that I'm quite a nag in the mornings. But without that, we would still be sitting at home at 9 o'clock. So it didn't start the day on a good note. You know, you try not to have frustration or bad feelings before school, especially because then the whole day just goes wrong. But again, I talk about the frustration, thinking, you know, you 6 years old, why can't you do this? Um, and when you hear your friends' children are all managing to do it and they're quietly sitting having their breakfast and they're all dressed and ready to go, and it's like the Wild West here in the Hanegraaf house. Um, so it was incredibly frustrating. But again, I just put it down to the fact that he'll get there. He'll get there. And yeah, because purely we had this stereotypical idea of what an ADHD child is like, and that's just wasn't him. So we got the experts report, the occupational therapist's report, and we thought, well, we just got to go with it. We were very wrong.
Laura, and then in the afternoon after school, what was the routine like coming home, trying to do work with him and homework and that routine for bed and getting him to sleep? How was that?
Homework was always a challenge, but not as much as the homeschooling because it's a lot less. And his reading has always been very good. Um, the writing part of the homework was always quite challenging. And he would often say to me, well, how much more do we have to do? How much more do we have to do? And you know, it wasn't a lot, but he'd be worrying about the volume before we'd even started the homework. But he would come home from school. We'd have half an hour for him to have a snack, and something to drink. And then I would try and get the homework done as soon as possible. Because the later it gets, the worse it is. On sport days where they do sport, they only get home at 2. Then after half an hour, and then 2:30 trying to start, he's been up since 6. We were struggling to get much out of him at all. And actually, the homework wasn't really benefiting. He wasn't learning anything by the homework. It was just a repetitive thing to just get it done. And then once that was done, literally the whole afternoon would be spent jumping on the trampoline or running around the garden. Or nowadays, he's quite into gaming. So not the healthiest, but that's kind of what he tends to do to relax now. But prior to his assessment and the medication, it would be anything but a puzzle or a coloring or anything to do with schoolwork. And in fact, coloring was considered to be homework, and don't ask him to do it unless it's compulsory. It was that bad. So not great. Bedtimes have always been good with Alex. From the time he was about 9 months old, he's actually slept really well. We've been very lucky. He's had a strict routine though. We've always followed a routine. It's the same thing every night: bath, brush teeth, 5 minutes with us in the bed, and then off to your own bed. And his bedtime is at 7. And I would say by about 1:15 at the latest, unless he's worrying about something, he's asleep.
When you came for the assessment, that whole process, how did you feel beforehand, during the assessment, and then afterwards? How did it sort of change your mind? How did you feel? Were you shocked? Did you sort of have difficulty sort of getting your mind around the whole issue of ADHD and understanding it?
No, I had no issues with the understanding of how it worked because you explained it to us so beautifully with the images of the contrast MRI scan and showing me that it was the way the dopamine is spread out through the brain, and before and after medication, what the brain looks like. So the understanding of it was never an issue. My initial feeling after his diagnosis and throughout the assessment was actually relief that something could be seen that was actually causing a problem, and that this wasn't behavioral or a lack of capacity, but absolute relief that somebody else can see that there's a problem here, but you know how to fix it. So that was my initial feeling. nobody wants their child to have a learning difficulty. Nobody wants a diagnosis like that. But when you've struggled for as long as we've struggled, it was a relief to know that we could do something to help him instead of continuing to do the same thing with the same results. Watching his confidence just dive through grade 1 because he was working his socks off and nothing was, there was no result from that. And now knowing a reason why. And then I felt guilty, very, very guilty. I should have done more. If I'd have worked with him more on desk-based work, sorry. If I'd have worked with him more on desk-based work when he was little, instead of letting him play in the garden and do all of that, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe, I could have worked harder, something, when actually what we should have done is just bring him to you sooner. And that guilt still stays with me a bit, that I let it go on for so long without doing something.
I don't believe that. I think all parents blame themselves for, I think, a lot of different things. And maybe, I think the schooling system and the recognition of it very early on, I think maybe is not as good. You think other therapists that he's been attending, going in and having therapy with, they would maybe have, given a bit more of a pointer to it. But, I think that that's a natural feeling that all parents are going to have. And I think what you're saying to me is what everybody says. Now, Laura, what I'd like to hear, when he started on the medication, what did you see? And what were you initially worried about? What was the sort of change that you saw on the medicine?
From day one, and he went on the medication when we were homeschooling still. Well, I still get goosebumps. I can't help it. I cannot explain it. It literally is that cliche. It was like night and day. It was like somebody switched the lights on for this child. And it wasn't that he was learning more going forward. Just everything that was locked in was able to come out. I mean, it would take us from 8 in the morning. We would start religiously every morning at 8 o'clock. And it would take us till about 1:30 to get through the curricula. The day 1 on the medication, we finished at 10:30, and it was beautiful. Beautiful work. His whole demeanor, he embraced it. He enjoyed it. I kept going, my husband was working from home at the time, and I kept going through to him saying, this is not my child. Where's Alex? And it really has been like that ever since. The wonder of it wears off because now we're getting used to him being able to do everything. But I constantly remind myself where we were and where he is now. And as much as for me the decision was quite hard initially, you kind of made it easy when you explained that no, it doesn't matter what else we do, if we can't sort out the chemical balance, it's futile. So for me, it was, in the end, an easy decision, because why would you not? I spoke to a lot of young adults whom I'm friendly with, who have subsequently, as adults, been diagnosed with ADHD. And I said to them, if this had been done when you were at school, would you, in hindsight, have wanted to be medicated or not? And they all said to me, 100% of the people I spoke to said they wished that they had been. Because as adults now, that lack of confidence, belief in themselves, that it doesn't matter how hard you work, you can't get the results, is still with them now. So for me, it was an easy decision in the end.
I mean, you've described it in an amazing way, such an articulate way, you know. You make it, you have such an amazing insight, you know, and I just wish, and I think that's why I'm so grateful that you are able to share what you've just shared, because that's my wish, is your experience and your words that you've used. If anybody can hear that, it is the most life transforming diagnosis and experience. It is literally has the power to change someone's life in a completely 180 degrees. It is almost as though you're going along in a direction and you get to a crossroads and you have to make a decision. Do I turn left or do I turn right? And if you think of, if you had kept going down the one road, if you kind of take 10 years, 20 years ahead, where you'd be, you know. But what I think he's had for me, Laura, is that the reason that I think he got as far as he did is because you filled in the gaps. You took over those functions of his brain that he was unable to self-control himself. You were the one that filled in those gaps, and you still are, I think. You know, you are still filling in those gaps.
Yeah.
Wow, it is amazing. You see, the most effective thing about treatment of this is one thing, having a diagnosis. It's one thing being on treatment, but the next thing is, how do you help your child? And that's what you do. You know, it's what you do, not what other people do. That's something they're going to do at school and so forth, the therapist, the occupational therapist. But the most important outcome measure is the mother. Because let's face it, a mother spends the most amount of time with the child. So that's amazing. For me, is he just finally, thank you very much, would you, if you had to say, if I'd ask you, would there be any message that you would give to any parent or anybody, what message would you give to them that when they say, you know, they'll outgrow it, it's not such a bad thing, because the name of ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity. I mean, it sounds like it's such an innocuous, a mild problem, just a little bit of hyperactivity, maybe you calm down, a little bit of attention, maybe. It sounds such a ridiculous problem. You understand what I'm saying? When people hear that, they don't understand the real impact of it. Is there anything you'd say?
I have some advice for parents so that they don't go down the same road I did initially. Okay, listen to your child's teachers. Try and understand that they aren't trying to make their jobs easier. They are trained to see red flags. And as soon as they say the word red flag, we put our backs up and we shy away from it. I wish I had listened sooner. Again, the mindset, he's only little, he'll grow out of it. And some children do, I'm sure, but those children don't have ADHD. You don't grow out of that. It's always going to be that ogre in the room. And when I see how it's changed Alex's life, how he's confident, he loves school, he loves learning. If it's suggested that your child goes for an assessment, take them. There's no shame in that. Just take them, even if it's just to rule it out. If it's not that, have them seen by somebody else. Have them seen by a specialist. Don't just take them to your GP and say, we think, the teacher said they need to come to you, because with all the experience, that's what you're looking for. You know how to spot it. You know how to explain it to a parent properly, so that we don't all sit here thinking, oh, it's just a pill to make our child easier to manage. It's, if you had diabetes, you would take insulin, and this is this is a similar thing. It's not just going to, can't just walk it off. It's not going to heal itself. And yeah, just don't get roped into the mindset that your child has to be hyperactive or reckless or misbehaved to have ADHD. That is, if I could do anything now, I would create an awareness campaign that that is not the case. Because I think of the children that are out there that are not even brought for assessment because their parents thought exactly as I did. He's not showing any of the signs. But if you don't know what the signs of all types of ADHD are, you don't know if they are or not. And lastly, advocate for your child. Go to the teachers every year at the beginning of the year, explain their personalities, their quirks, their issues. They might be a little slow, but it's because they are trying to do it properly rather than rushing through and making it untidy. Explain to them they've got 25 other kids that they have to get to know personality-wise. So give them the crib notes and let them know your child so they don't have to struggle through that first term.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's amazing. You've got an amazing articulate way and insight. And, it just shows me how much you care about Alex. That comes from a mother who understands her child in such detail and has such attention to detail. The way you talk, you can understand how much time in your life that you put into him, and as a result, you're seeing the results. Can I ask you the medication? What are the things that you see and that maybe you were worried about, or maybe that you thought that there would be a problem with the kind of fears of the medicine, and some of the things that maybe that weren't true?
I was concerned about it changing his personality. That is one of the things that comes up often amongst parents that talk to each other. But I have learned very, very quickly that a properly medicated child by a specialist, it doesn't do anything to their personalities. In fact, all it's done is turn him from being introverted and constantly anxious and worried to being confident. He wants to speak out. He wants to please. He works his little socks off, and when they tell him he's done a great job, I see his little chest puffs out with pride, and it hasn't changed him in any way but for the good. And the only reason why it's changed for the good is because he's not struggling anymore. I was a little worried about the appetite because he's always been a very picky eater, and it has had, I would say, an effect, not a huge amount, because as I say, he's never really been great, but you can get around that. So instead of serving up big meals for breakfast and things like that, rather pack a punch with a Future Life bar or something like that, that they can eat on the go, eat in the car on the way to school if they need to, but just get that protein in there somehow. Little snacks, little bits of dry balls at snack time and things like that. So if they're not hungry, they're getting a lot of protein in a very small amount of food. And usually by about 3 o'clock, that's worn off and his appetite is back, and he always eats a good dinner. So anything that we haven't been able to get through in the day, he kind of usually makes up for at dinner time. And he's holding his own. He's not stacking on weight by any stretch, but he's not losing weight. He's strong. He's so healthy. So what he gets calorie-wise is enough for him at the moment.
Laura, thank you so much for doing this interview. I really do appreciate it. I think your story, you don't realize what an impact it's going to make to other parents. That's the primary reason, I've set up the Facebook group, and to just be able to, I sit and see, parents like yourself on a one-to-one, but it's an amazing impact that you can almost touch many lives, not just one, and that is what really I'm excited about with what you've said, and I really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I really do hope that this does help get rid of the stigmas that are attached to it, put out the facts, and realize that there's nothing better than being able to find a solution to a problem. Don't fight it. Go with it. It's changed our lives. It's changed Alex's life. Um, and it's just so important. That Facebook group is excellent. You've answered questions that I've had before I've even asked them. And people must watch those videos. They must, parents, even parents whose children don't have ADHD, because you learn so much. You learn to watch out for other little signs. And if we can just do the right thing by our children, their whole lives, the sky's the limit.